Aloha and welcome to Island Connections. I am Brahim Aoude and our topic tonight is Frederick Bush, Palestine and Israel. And to discuss the topic for tonight, we have three members of Sabeel in Hawaii, and you will let us know what the organization is doing, etc. Margaret Brown, thanks for coming. George Hudis, thank you. And Robert Stiver, thank you for coming. So before we start, maybe you can tell us something about the organization Sabeel in Hawaii, and why do we have Frederick Bush, Palestine and Israel? You know, why Frederick Bush? You know, who's Frederick Bush and what the organization has to do with bringing Frederick Bush to Hawaii and so on.
Well, Friends of Sabeel in Hawaii was started in March of 2001, I believe, and that's when the Reverend Naim Atik, who's a Palestinian from Jerusalem. He was the retired canon of St. George's Cathedral in Jerusalem. He came to Hawaii at the invitation of Church of the Crossroads to give a lecture series called the Wat Hata Lecture Series. And several of us were very impressed with his speaking and also his book, which is called Justice and Only Justice. And we read that at our church, and several other people read it. So that was the beginning of Friends of Sabeel in Hawaii.
Yeah, good. And George, so what is Friends of Sabeel? What does the name mean, and why did you have it here? I mean, this organization.
Well, Sabeel is it's a type of liberation theology, and it's based on St. George's Episcopal Church in Jerusalem, as Margaret has said. But it's really an international organization based in Jerusalem, which I think attempts to educate people as to the nature of the issues in Palestine, Israel, so that more people may have an understanding of what's truly going on there, so perhaps there can be some sort of international consensus built that can help move things towards a peace with justice. And that's peace for both Palestinians and Israelis, and justice for both Palestinians and Israelis. And I think Sabeel provides a kind of umbrella under which people of many faiths or faith backgrounds can try to work together and in harmony with one another. It's interesting, in much of the world, it's an ecumenical organization, which is an inter-Christian organization. Here in Hawaii, I'm not sure that we're the only place where it's actually an interfaith organizations. We have Muslims, Christians, Jews, and probably quite a few agnostics who are members. So all of those people have been working together to try to bring information to people so that they can make informed decisions about where they stand on this.
Right. And Bob, would you like to expand on this? Anything you would like to add to the question?
Well, let me just say that Sabeel is an Arabic word, and it has a couple of meanings that I know of, but I tend to say the way, as in the way to peace with justice. So, as Margaret said, we've been meeting regularly the third Tuesday of every month at Church of the Crossroads at the moment, and we have activities that we pursue, and as George said, we're trying to educate the public.
Good. Before we show like video clips from Frederick Bush, who came to Hawaii on the invitation of Friends of Sabeel, and he gave a lot of lectures and so on. Before we do that, want to familiarize the viewers with the map of the Middle East, yeah? So we have the map of the Middle East, and then you can see Iraq. That's where U.S. occupation is taking place now. And then towards on the Mediterranean, actually, there is Lebanon in the north, just below Syria, which you can see Syria. And below Lebanon, there is Israel, Palestine. There's the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, and there is occupation of the Gaza Strip and the West Bank by Israeli forces. So there are two occupations already in the Middle East at this point. So just to show like where the countries are in relationship to one another. You know, that is the small Middle East, actually. Some people might also, for purposes of, for academic purposes, might include, North Africa as well, although Egypt is in North Africa, but there's also Libya and Tunisia, etc. But we don't have that map, not necessarily for us here, but just to show that. And then we want to show also another map to have the viewer appreciate, the question of Palestine and Israel. And this is the map of Israel, and the one with the dark boundary around it is the West Bank, and to the bottom left of the screen there is the Gaza Strip. Both the Gaza Strip and the West Bank are occupied territories since 1967. And it's interesting now, since 1994, with the Oslo Accord, there have been these three areas within the West Bank. And this is the kind of yellowish area up in the north. This is areas presumably controlled fully by the Palestinian National Authority. And there are some other areas of the same color in the south, like Hebron and Jericho and so on. These are the areas controlled by the Palestinian National Authority. The green areas are, in terms of security, Israeli forces have the security responsibility for that area, but in terms of administrative, civilian purposes, etc., it's the Palestinian National Authority. And the white area of the West Bank, it's all under Israeli control, fully under Israeli control. So just to appreciate what we're talking about when we begin to discuss those kinds of issues. But also it's interesting on the map, if we could show the map just quickly again, is that how these areas are not contiguous areas, if you can see. They are separated, and this is one major issue in terms of what's going on now with the occupation and so on. But just to give us an idea. So having watched that, we can begin by showing, the first clip of Fred Bush's talk when he came here, and he gave a talk at Kuykendall Hall, where we are now, but on the first floor. Yes?
Could I mention just one thing?
Yeah.
On that map, you indicated areas that are nominally under Palestinian control.
Right.
I do think it's important that we point out, though, that the whole area is under Israeli military control ultimately.
Right.
That though they delegate some tasks to the Palestinian Authority, that whenever the Israeli authorities are dissatisfied, there's nothing to stop them from coming in and doing basically whatever they want.
Yes, exactly. And that is, this whole area now are under Israeli occupation. Yeah, because, just like yesterday, I believe, or the day before, Israeli forces rolled into the Gaza Strip, right? And they are in control. I mean, they're surrounding Arafat's demolished headquarters. He's been there over 2.5 years now in those headquarters, and he cannot go out of there, and so on. So just, that is a point well taken and needs to be said. But in terms of Fred Bush, when he came here and he talked from his experiences about the Palestinian-Israeli situation, and he's so concerned because of his theological background as an academic and as a practitioner as well. He is concerned in terms of peace in the Middle East. So when he gave that lecture, when he came here, I think in April, right? He came here, and this past April. So there are segments that we're gonna show from his talk, and then we can comment on those segments. And in fact, what's going on now in terms of peace in the Middle East.
Yes,
so
actually, the lecture we're going to see was recorded on April 19th. That's
April
when he was
19th.
here.
Okay, yeah. Okay, that's good. Thanks. So we, I think, are ready to watch the first clip.
During the 5 years of the Oslo Interim Accords, the number of Israeli settlements increased by 50%. They were supposed to be withdrawing. And the total number of Jewish settlers in the West Bank doubled. West Bank and East Jerusalem doubled from 200,000 to 400,000. Secondly, what the Palestinians experienced on the ground and in their daily lives during the Oslo period led them to conclude, and I believe rightly so, that the so-called Oslo peace process, however it began and whatever its intentions were on the part of the leaders that were then in charge, notably Yitzhak Rabin, who will remember later was assassinated, however it began, had become simply an Israeli mechanism to prolong and indeed make permanent the status quo of an oppressive occupation, with its ever-expanding settlements and bypass roads. The map you have here shows the bypass roads that were built by the Israelis during the Oslo process, during the 5 years, designed to bypass all the Palestinian areas of occupation and connect the settlements with Israel proper and with one another. These bypass roads are security roads, so the road itself is very wide and very well built. It has security on each side of the order of about a football field. So Israel built, during the Oslo process, some 250 miles in the West Bank, an area about the size of Delaware, that were 4 football fields wide, and you can see how they chopped up the area the Palestinians lived in, the shaded area on the map, into these isolated enclaves. To this was added dozens and dozens of checkpoints and restriction of movement, and finally, because of all this, the complete collapse of the Palestinian economy with the resulting severe unemployment and extreme poverty. Instead of life getting better during those 5 years, life got dramatically worse. These results produced a deep and simmering bitterness, anger, frustration, and hopelessness that only needed a provocation to burst into violence again with a new intifada or uprising. And I'm sure we are all well aware that, I won't take the time here to say very much about it, that that provocation was occasioned by the failure of the Camp David summit in July 2000, succeeded by Ariel Sharon's brazen invasion of what we in the West called the Temple Mount, in the east side of the old city of Jerusalem, and what the Palestinians and Muslims call the Haram al-Sharif, the noble sanctuary with its mosques that go back virtually to the time of the first Muslim invasion and occupation of the Middle East in the 8th century AD. The massive security forces that surrounded Sharon used rubber bullets against the unarmed demonstrators that objected to this brazen visit. And when these events triggered further demonstrations the next day, Ehud Barak, who was then the Prime Minister of Israel, radically escalated the Israeli response and ordered soldiers and tanks into the densely populated Palestinian areas. And the result was this grassroots rebellion, now called the Al-Aqsa Intifada, after the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which Ariel Sharon chose to visit. That has continued from that day to this, and has resulted in what I call, and I think there's no other word for it, the current catastrophe.
So, Frederick Bush is talking about the Oslo Accords of 1993 that created the Palestinian National Authority, and we talked a little bit about it when we were showing the map. But he also talks about the bad intentions of Israel, it seems to me. Rather than going to peace, they begin to erect more settlements and increase the number of settlers, even though the idea was to roll back those kinds of things and to show the good intentions for peace and so on. So what happened, Bob? What do you think was going on there?
Well, when we speak of Israel's intentions, let me take this opportunity to refer to this book which I'm currently reading. It's The Iron Wall by Avi Shlaim. And I would like to read a quotation early on in this book from Menachem Begin, who ultimately became Prime Minister of Israel, but at the time this quotation was uttered from his mouth was in 1947. He was speaking about the United Nations partition of Palestine in 1947 into a two-state situation of Israel, which was given 55% of the land of Palestine, and then for Palestine it was 45% of what had been their traditional homeland. And Menachem Begin at that time said, quote, "The partition of Palestine is illegal. It will never be recognized. Jerusalem was and will forever be our capital. Eretz Israel," that means Greater Israel, "will be restored to the people of Israel, all of it, and forever," unquote. So it is clear to me from history that the Israeli response to the Oslo Accords was in accord with information that began
Can we show the book again?
way back at the birth of Israel.
And this writer is an Israeli or what?
He's an Israeli.
Israeli.
He's Jewish. He's a historian, and for
At Oxford.
and
that's
teaches
right.
at
He
Oxford.
teaches at Oxford, England. That's correct.
Okay. So and he wrote those things. Yeah. George, could you tell us more about your reaction to what Frederick Bush was talking about?
Well, my reading leads me to conclude that he's correct, that there has been continuous bad faith on the part of Israel. Number one, the Oslo Accords were extremely ambiguous. There were many people who questioned whether they would work from the very beginning, knowing the pattern of distrust and duplicity that has existed around this issue of Palestine-Israel for many years. There were many things that were ambiguous, that were left to interpretation. But beyond that, Israel exhibited continuous bad faith, if through nothing else, through the expansion of the settlements. And there's an old statement, facts on the ground. This is a statement of which Sharon is known for, that once you have facts on the ground, that's more important than any doctrines and any treaties and any agreements, etc. And this has been a continuous strategy of Israel to establish facts on the ground. So by establishing these settlements, and of course these settlements are comprised of the most radical, ultra-Orthodox Israelis around. So they're used as the front lines. And so that kind of bad faith, of course, Palestinians looked around and said, what's going on? This is not what we understood was going to happen. In 5 years, we were supposed to have a Palestinian state. And then in addition to that, there were other things, such as very frequently Israel points to the terrorists and says, well, there's been bad faith by the Palestinians. I think we should remember that suicide bombings only occurred after Baruch Goldstein slaughtered, I forget how many Muslim worshippers.
About 40 or something.
About 40 worshippers in the Hebron mosque. So if, who started what, well, we can go back through history. But in any case, that was a development that occurred after Oslo and after the settlements were being increased and after Baruch Goldstein's terrorist action. So, and this pattern of bad faith has falls very much in step, as Bob Stiver pointed out, with a historical pattern by Israel. I mean, they're very strategic thinkers, and the Israelis, and I would like to call them the Israelis, not the Jews.
Yes, of course.
I have a personal vested interest in that. And also, this is a strategy by Israel to call themselves the Jewish state and to refer to Israelis as Jews. Because, of course, this then creates a greater worldwide identity, but there is much dissatisfaction with these policies, both amongst Israelis themselves. Perhaps we could compare it to Bush and his policies in Iraq. There are many Americans who oppose that. So
not Frederick Bush, but
George W. Bush. So anyway, I think that Frederick Bush is correct, that there was fundamental bad faith, and this was in spite of the fact that during this time there were many joint ventures occurring between Israel and the Palestinians. There was investment coming into Palestine. There were new business ventures developing between Israel and the Arab world. Things were truly taking a direction towards constructive peace. And this was, if sabotaged by anybody, this was sabotaged by the Israeli authorities.
Yeah, I just want to have an aside here, you know, and talking about like how the Israelis like to talk about Israel as the Jewish state and create worldwide connections. Linda Lingle, our illustrious governor, Margaret, is going with a delegation to Israel to create some kind of relationship between Hawaii and Israel, because they're talking about like both places are isolated. You know, Israel is isolated in the Arab world, and Hawaii is isolated in the middle of the Pacific. So, any comments on this, and what do you think about that?
Well, it's another instance of AIPAC, which is the Israeli-American, what does that stand for? American-Israeli
Public Affairs.
Public Affairs
Committee.
Committee. It's a very active and very powerful lobbying group. And one of their favorite things is to take groups of American politicians over to Israel. And they shepherd them around, and they give them a very skewed picture of what's going on. And they give them lots of money, and they support their campaigns, and they also do things to the opponents of these people to try to ensure that they're not elected. So it's interesting. It always bothers me when our elected officials are taking money from a foreign country to go on a fancy trip.
Yeah, it's like an interesting thing because especially now with all these revelations in Iraq taking place about prison torture and stuff, and everybody like, you know, is flabbergasted and really is incensed about this dehumanization and so on. But in fact, a lot of these things are taking place in Israeli detention centers and jails, and Palestinians are being dehumanized and humiliated on a daily basis, not only in jails but under occupation because of the repression, etc., etc.
Could I add something to that? Yeah, I think actually what Linda Lingle is doing is shameful. I mean, the current Israeli regime, the Sharon regime, has been criticized by the Israeli Human Rights Organization for its racist brutality against Palestinians, by B'Tselem, which is the Israeli Human Rights Organization. It has been soundly criticized by international human rights organizations like Amnesty International. So to be going to Israel, and I've read Linda Lingle's statements, it's as if she's working out her identity as an American Jew on state time. That is inappropriate, and it's shameful that she's doing it going to a country like this, which has been criticized and continues to be criticized for its human rights abuses, and which has never hesitated to lend assistance to other regimes in the world that have violated human rights, like South Africa before the apartheid regime was overturned, like Honduras as a surrogate for the United States. So Israel has a long history of ignoring human rights or being a violator of human rights. And if Linda Lingle was going to Israel to help foster business relationships and investments with Hawaii, that could be done on a very different format. But she's taking a canned Zionist tour of Israel, which occurs to sell her on all the wonderful things that are going on, much like the tour that Representative Ed Case took last summer. And this is, it'd be different if she were making independent contacts with Christian and Muslim organizations, if she were making independent contacts to go visit the refugee camps in the Palestinian territories, if she were making independent contacts to go visit places like Ramallah, Hebron, where these atrocities are taking place. But that is not what she is doing. And if you look at the people who are going along with her, I mean, this is a canned sales strip.
Yeah. So, like, basically, it's a political move on her part, and because if she really wants to know what's really going on, she has to go and visit the other side as well, right?
I think so.
But also not on company time, so to speak.
She's
And-
working out her identity
Yeah,
issues on
right.
company time.
Yeah, and I don't want her to represent me as a resident of Hawaii, because she says they are representing all the state of Hawaii as a whole. I don't want her to represent me, so minus me, please. I don't know how you feel about it, but a lot of people are incensed about it. A friend of mine called me this morning. He said, I'm one person, and he called Linda Lingel's office, and he told them that he's a Republican, and he's not going to vote for her anymore, and that this is shameful, and they shouldn't be doing this kind of thing. If she wants to work out her own identity, that's fine, let her do that, but not drag Hawaii into this mess that's happening in the Middle East. And Hawaii would be dragged in a big way, and that is not good. So I just wanted to say that. We have a question from a caller. When for George or Bob, when does your group meet at the Church of the Crossroads? You mentioned
We meet the third Tuesday of every month at 7 o'clock p.m. in Weaver Hall in Church of the Crossroads.
Yeah.
That's on University Avenue.
Okay,
The next
good.
meeting is this coming Tuesday night.
Correct.
Right,
Next
the
week,
next
Tuesday
Tuesday night. Yeah. Okay, great.
I just
now,
got word from
yeah.
Margaret.
Now I wanna go to another segment from Fred Bush. He's talking about from his speech, talking about the situation in the Middle East. So we go.
However, I believe that there are two very revealing aspects of the current circumstances that enable one to understand why Palestinian extremists continue such indefensible acts of revenge when it is clear that the policy has badly harmed the Palestinian cause in all respects, especially here in the United States and especially with the current American administration. The first of these is perhaps obvious from what I've already said, and that is the realities of life for Palestinians under the occupation. As an example, let me consider what the Palestinians endured during the first 2 months of the Al-Aqsa Intifada. In an article published in the right-wing Israeli daily newspaper, Ma'ariv, on September the 6th, 2002, the right-wing Israeli journalist, Ben Caspit, wrote as follows. For many years, the IDF had been preparing for this intifada. And when it interrupted, the IDF is the Israeli Defense Forces, the army, and when it erupted, the army released its prolonged frustration on the Palestinians who did not know what hit them. To illustrate this fact, he told the following story. About 3 weeks after the beginning of the Al-Aqsa Intifada, General Amos Malka asked the district intelligence officer, tell me, how many bullets has the army fired since the beginning of the Intifada? The man had no idea, so Malka asked him to find out. When the answer arrived around noon, most of the officers who were present, according to an eyewitness, turned white. In the first 3 weeks of the Intifada, the Israeli army fired about 700,000 bullets and other shells and projectiles in the West Bank, and about 300,000 in Gaza. All told, about 1 million bullets and other projectiles were used. Someone in the Central Command later quipped that the project should be named "A Bullet for Every Child." End quote from a right-wing Israeli newspaper. After discussing and setting forth further examples of this extreme Israeli overreaction, Caspit continued. Some government and security officials believe that perhaps the army's destructive response and the blow inflicted on the Palestinians during the first weeks were directly responsible for the deteriorating situation and the escalation that followed. During those weeks, the first month, Israel took very few casualties, in contrast with the numerous Palestinians dead and wounded. The ratio between Israeli and Palestinian casualties was 1 to 20, end quote. Indeed, by the end of the first month, 117 Palestinians had been killed, including 32 children under the age of 18, 18 of them under 16, with only 4 Israeli deaths. And there had been no suicide attacks whatsoever. So the killing of these 117 Palestinians was not inadvertent, and it was not a response to any kind of violent response other than what was going on in the Intifada, which consisted mainly of rock throwing, since the Palestinians are largely unarmed.
Yeah, I mean, that's interesting. And Frederick Bush uses Israeli sources, right wing, center, left wing, etc., Israeli sources to construct his argument to show the inhumanity and the repression that Israelis are doing against the Palestinians. But he talked about a couple of months after the beginning of the Second Intifada, the casualties, etc. I have graphs here we're going to show that are rather revealing, despite all the suicide bombings and all these kind of things that are horrific, actually, and shouldn't be done and should be condemned. Here are some of the things that speak volumes. For instance, Israeli and Palestinians injured since the beginning of the Intifada, the Second Intifada, 2000, September 29th, 2000. Okay, so the Palestinian is in the red, the Israeli is in the blue. So you see how many people were injured from both camps, yeah? Then the second one, it's another interesting graph, right? Israelis and Palestinians killed since the Second Intifada. Again, you look at the graphs, yeah? You show the horrific, things that the Israelis are doing to the Palestinians, and the asymmetry of power and force and all that, so that's another thing. A third one I want to show a few of them, actually. A third one I want to show is Israelis and Palestinian children killed, Also, you see the ratio, the proportion is just absolutely amazing. And then the fourth one, if we can show the fourth one, Israelis, this fourth one talks about Israelis and Palestinians' homes destroyed. Yeah, hardly any homes. No homes actually, in terms of zero. Yeah, so but Palestinians, homes are destroyed, and this speaks to collective punishment, which is illegal under international law. And these are the collective punishments that, like, Nazi regime used to do against people they conquer and so on. So that's I have two more to show. In fact, that shows, in fact, how many settlements were built from 2001, March 2001, till July 2003. New settlements built, over 60 settlements were built. And these were illegal. I mean, settlements, according to international law, are illegal. The United States initially had it as illegal. And then later on, they started to say, they are obstacles to peace under Reagan. Under Carter, they were illegal, the U.S. position. Under Reagan, they were obstacles to peace. And under Bush 1 and Clinton and Bush 2, they were okay. It's okay to have settlements. So even the Americans, are not really neutral in this situation. They are pro-Israeli, as we have seen with the Bush issue. The last one I want to show, which is all of these would not have happened really without U.S. assistance, yeah? And U.S. assistance, daily U.S. assistance to Israel and the Palestinians, you just look at the comparison. It's rather fascinating. There's U.S. grants to Israel daily. Not daily, but we show the daily one. But yearly grants, 3 billion minimum. Yeah, and there's more than 3 billion. Yeah, grants. But these are direct. Yeah, but there are other grants. There are loans, guaranteed loans, and all that kind of stuff, and the billions of dollars we're talking about. So this shows where the U.S. policy is in the Middle East, and that is favoring Israel over the national and human rights of the Palestinians.
May I add one thing?
Sure.
To that, Rahim? Of those over 3 billion in direct assistance, that in itself is problematic. I mean, that's 1/6 of our total foreign direct aid.
Right.
But of that over 3 billion, it has become increasingly military assistance. And this is to one of the most powerful military nations in the world. I think it's ranked 3rd in the world. So, I mean, no other nation in the Middle East can even approach the power of Israel. And so I think it's shameful that it used to be a much larger percentage of humanitarian assistance for social welfare projects, etc. It has become the majority of it is now military assistance, and where is that used? That military assistance is used primarily in repressing and brutalizing the Palestinians.
Yeah, I just wanted to show this, but Margaret, could you further comment on what Fred Bush was talking about from your readings and information?
That figure on the number of bullets just really got to me. I mean, a country would waste that many bullets only if it had such a huge military budget, which is coming from us, the taxpayers of the U.S., and we're paying for those bullets, and that really bothers me. So, you know, if you have a lot of money for the military, they're going to use it.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, and they're
And
using
waste
it.
it even.
They're using it to repress Palestinians, right? Yeah. So, Bob, do you have any other comments before we go?
Well, I think we've addressed the disproportionality of U.S. assistance to Israel, and in my estimation, it's just sad. The common people in both Israel and Palestine want peace. They both want justice. And it is as Dr. Bush said in his lecture, I don't know if we'll get to that particular clip, but he spoke to the militarization of Israel. And he particularly pointed out to the last two prime ministers who have been generals, Barak and now Ariel Sharon. But Israel has become progressively more militaristic for decades. There's, of course, military duty there that's obligatory, and then everyone is in the reserves. But the entire society is controlled, really, by the military. It's called a vibrant democracy, the only democracy in the Middle East, although Palestine is also a democracy. Jimmy Carter supervised their elections back in around 1996. But the military continually harps on security. They, in effect, frighten their own population. Ariel Sharon campaigned and was elected on the basis of peace and security. Well, he's brought neither peace nor security to his own people, and he has brought misery on the collective population of Palestine that we sitting here cannot even contemplate. We cannot even imagine.
Yeah, we're gonna see the third clip, and we'll talk more about those things. Yeah.
But there's another reason why the suicide attacks continued, and that is the fact that there is a revealing pattern to the cycle of violence. You'll see that on your outline. On a number of occasions, Arafat and the Palestinian Authority actually stopped the violence by making agreements with Hamas and Islamic Jihad and the other brigades to halt suicide attacks within Israel itself. It was okay to attack the senators, it was the settlers, it was okay to attack the army, but not to attack civilians inside Israel. But numerous times when this occurred, when this agreement was made, Sharon's military government then carried out one of its assassinations of leaders of these groups whom they alleged, without setting forth any proof, to be terrorists. The timing of these Israeli actions indicates that they were clearly calculated to bring on another suicide attack in retaliation, and so provide further justification for the Israeli army's desire to take over the West Bank, which we'll talk about in a minute or two. This reality was widely reported in the Israeli press. For example, in an article published July the 31st, 2002, entitled "Israel's War for Terrorism," Professor Ran HaKohen, who teaches at the Tel Aviv University's Department of Comparative Literature, wrote as follows: "Time and again, Israeli assassinations abruptly ended prolonged periods of hope. In November 2001, the assassination of the Hamas activist Mahmoud Abu Hanoud was carried out just when Hamas was respecting for 2 months its agreement with Arafat not to attack inside Israel. And in January 2002, the assassination of Ra'ad Karmi ended a few weeks of relative quiet in the territories. One of the worst and most brutal examples of this policy occurred in Gaza in July 2002. In the Israeli newspaper Yediot Achronot on July the 24th, 2002, the newspaper reported that 2 days earlier, quote, the heads of Tanzim, the military wing of Fatah, Arafat's party, the heads of Tanzim convened at Jenin, approved the text of a communique calling unilaterally for an end to fighting by Tanzim, Hamas, and Islamic Jihad. A few hours before, Muhammad Dahlan, who was the head of Palestinian security in the Gaza Strip, met with the Hamas leader, Sheikh Ahmed Yassin, who just a few weeks ago was assassinated, in which Yassin accepted the principles of the ceasefire communique. The communique itself, published later by the Palestinian information organization Infopal, was specific and unconditional, stating, quote, we make this declaration. We will do everything in our power to end attacks on Israeli civilians, on innocent men, women, and children. We will do this without seeking any prior gain. The rivers of blood that have so embittered our peoples will be staunched. The suicide bombings will be brought to an end by us now. Israel's reaction, unfortunately, was immediate and swift. 1.5 hours after the Tanzim leadership approved the document at its Jenin gathering, Israel carried out the assassination of Salah Shahadeh, an alleged terrorist in Gaza City. Ran HaKohen, in another article, wrote about that attack this way. The operation was no mistake. Whoever gave the order to drop in the middle of the night a 1,000 kilogram bomb, 2,000-pound bomb, on a residential house in one of the most densely populated strips on earth knew very well what he was doing. It was a premeditated act of state terrorism, a cold-blooded massacre. 14 innocent civilians, 9 of them children, were killed, and 170 people were wounded, many of them badly, to ensure the continuation of Palestinian terrorism in which many more innocent civilians will be killed. As a result, the Tanzim Declaration was never issued, and in short order, the cycle of violence continued with another suicide attack and another Israeli reaction and further invasion of the West Bank.
So, Margaret, this seems to be deliberate, I mean, from all the evidence so far, and the Israeli sources as well. So, any comments on that?
Well, it's really hard for people to accept that, but I think what he says is correct. And I just was remembering a book that I read recently. This is called Terrorism and War by Howard Zinn. It came out a few years ago.
Yeah,
But, you know, there are terrorists who act alone, and there is state terrorism. And dropping bombs on civilians is state terrorism.
Mm-hmm.
And it's happening all over the world.
Yeah. But there's a reason for that, of course, because it seems to me that the Israeli government, the Zionists, have a plan, and the one that Bob was talking about, you know, when you spoke about Menachem Begin, and even it goes back before Menachem Begin, yeah? So it shows that the Israelis have been using the Oslo Accords and so on to try and improve their position on the West Bank and create, as you mentioned, facts on the ground. It's rather interesting. But before we do this, because we still have time, but I would like to go to another segment of Frederick Bush, and then we can comment further on that.
The scale of the operations and the particular targets attacked and how they were attacked reveal with crystal clarity what the purposes of the invasion really were. The Israeli journalist, courageous journalist, Amira Haas, who was living in Ramallah during that year, the only Jew living in Ramallah, was able to observe and document what had transpired during the invasion. In an article published in Haaretz on April the 24th, 2002, just after the invasion ended, the end of the third week, Ms. Haas published a moving description of what she had seen. It's a, quote, "It's a scene that is repeating itself in hundreds of Palestinian offices taken over by army troops for a few hours or days in the West Bank. Smashed, burned, and broken computer terminals heaped in piles and thrown into yards. Server cabling cut. Hard disks missing. Disks and diskettes scattered and broken. Printers and scanners broken or missing. Laptops gone. Telephone exchanges that disappeared or were vandalized. Paper files burned, torn, scattered, or defaced if not taken. And it's all in rooms full of smashed furniture, torn curtains, broken windows, smashed in doors, walls full of holes, filthy floors, soiled bathrooms." Amira Haas continues, "It's not merely the expense of the replaced, the loss is immeasurable in shekels or dollars. Years of information built into knowledge, time spent thinking by thousands of people working to build their civil society and their future, or trying to build a private sector that would bring a sense of economic security to the country. These were the data banks developed in Palestinian Authority institutions like the Education Ministry, the Higher Education Ministry, the Health Ministry. These were the data banks of the non-governmental organizations and research institutes devoted to developing a modern health system, modern agriculture, environmental protection, and water conservation. These were the data banks of human rights organizations, banks, and private commercial enterprises, infirmaries, and supermarkets. They all were clearly the targets for destruction in the military operation called Defensive Shield. Let's not deceive ourselves. This was not a mission to search and destroy the terrorist infrastructure. The scenes of systematic destruction show how the army translated into the field the instructions inherent in the cabinet policies. Israel must destroy the Palestinian civil institutions, sabotaging them for years to come, sending all of Palestinian society backward. It's so easy and comforting to think of the entire Palestinian society as primitive, bloodthirsty terrorists after the raw material and product of their intellectual, cultural, social, and economic activity has been destroyed. That way, the Israeli public can continue to be deceived into believing that terror is a genetic problem, and not a sociological and political mutation, horrific as it may be, derived from the horrors of occupation. End of Amira Haas's report.
Well, I mean, here we go again. I mean, it's not only to deceive the Israeli public, but also the American public. And the American public has been ignorant of the facts simply because of the propaganda barrage. And they're not shown, alternative kind of views and the real thing that what's going on, just like what Fred Bush is talking about. So any comments on that, Margaret, on, what's happening here and why do we support Israel and all that?
Well, again, it's people are ignorant, and it's a willful ignorance, I think, too. And we just gotta educate people.
Yeah, through. I mean, that's what Friends of Sabil,
that's what we're
trying to do, and a number of mainline churches as well are, doing a lot of education about the Middle East. Yeah, and not propaganda, just like. What the Israelis are putting, yeah. So, any other comments, George? You were gonna say something.
Well, I think Frederick Bush's comments that it is a specific strategy of the Israeli authorities to undermine any genuine developments that might lead to peace that would have some justice for the Palestinians. That is an idea that is also well documented in Avi Shlaim's book.
Mm-hmm.
Avi Shlaim goes back before the current Intifada and documents how there were numerous situations prior to that when it appeared that Islamic Jihad, Hamas, was ready to call off their targeting of civilians in Israel. And just at those times, Israel would assassinate one of those leaders, which would basically undermine any attempt to reach such agreement. And his argument that Israel has purposefully sought to destroy any social infrastructure that could lead to a viable Palestinian society. That's very well documented. And it's a shame that many pro-Israeli groups, when you point out these types of documentation, here's another one by Tanya Reinhardt, a very good book which documents in great detail how the so-called Barak peace plan was no peace plan at all.
Right.
But when these things are talked about by pro-Israeli groups, they will label these things, even though they're by Jews, they'll call them anti-Semitic Jews or something like that. And they'll say, oh, that's not true. But you can search and search and search for detailed responses to these arguments, and they're simply not there. And unfortunately, the pro-Israel groups keep their audiences in inside walls of ignorance.
Yeah, and through emotions,
and through emotions, and of course,
right.
and they appeal to people's religious affiliations, whether we're talking about the Zionist evangelist Christians, of which President Bush is a part, or whether we're talking about super Zionist Jewish groups. I mean, they appeal to this to people's fears, to their religious affiliations, to their expectations of a great new religious age in the future. And but when it comes down to the actual logical and factual arguments that are extremely well documented, those are simply dismissed as propaganda. But you can search, as I say, for the arguments that disprove these. They are simply not there.
Right. I want to, before I ask Bob to comment, I want to go to another of the segments, Fred Bush segments, to continue the argument.
Jean Ziegler, a Swiss sociologist and UN envoy for the UN, the United Nations Human Rights Commission, spent 10 days in the West Bank last July with Israeli cooperation and prepared a report for the United Nations General Assembly on conditions there. The report, the honest report, so incensed the Israelis that they have blocked it being presented to the UN. So Ziegler has gone around the world, virtually, making public presentations of his facts. And in a press briefing on his report held last November the 12th in the United Nations briefing room, the main findings were as follows. 22% of Palestinian children under 5 are suffering from malnutrition, a 3-fold increase from 2000. 9.3% suffer acute malnutrition, an 8-fold increase from 2000. 15.6% suffer acute anemia, which can lead to a permanent impairment of physical and mental development. Food consumption has fallen 30% per capita. 60% of Palestinian households now live in acute poverty, and 50% are dependent on international food aid. The U.S. Agency for International Development issued a report last August citing the same statistics and stated that these are on a par with impoverished nations such as Chad and Nigeria, and actually surpasses rates of child malnutrition in Somalia and Bangladesh.
It's interesting that everyone is incensed about what's happening in Iraq, which has been happening for a long time, but just came out just recently. But no one is incensed about what's happening in Israel, even though it's more of the same. But for the longest time, for like 30-some years, this has been going on. But no pictures have been, there. What I want to do is go to the last segment of Fred Bush, and then we can discuss more. So we'll go to that one.
16 villages west of the wall have been de facto annexed to Israel. Even worse, 50 villages are located just inside the wall, and all their fields, their agricultural fields, are on the other side of the wall. The only entry they will have to their fields will be gates that will be opened at the pleasure of the Israeli army, and pleasure is not the right word. Further, the land between the wall and the green line has been declared by Israel to be a, quote, seam zone, and everybody who lives in that zone must have a special permit to live in the zone and to go to that zone where their homes are. Second, entire villages will be turned into Palestinian enclaves west of the barrier. You can see them in the looped circles outside of the barrier. On their website, Gush Shalom reports the following effects of this. 400,000 Palestinians will find themselves cut off from the cities around which their lives revolve. They will lose 25% of their land. Thirdly, the loss of this land in the northwestern part of the West Bank, that area up there where the red line is especially, and the black line around Qalqilia, will severely damage the Palestinian economy and way of life. This economy and way of life is essentially an agricultural one. As I mentioned, I studied the physical and historical geography of Palestine for a year in Israel and taught it for 25 years at Fuller Seminary. And I know full well that the average rainfall coming off the Mediterranean decreases immensely from the northern West Bank down to the end of the southern West Bank. So when you get just below that red line, which is the Israeli city of Beersheba, regular agriculture is not possible anymore without irrigation. But this area up here is rich with water and is essentially the breadbasket of the West Bank. Underneath that area is the largest underground aquifer in the mountain area of the West Bank, supplying the second largest freshwater resource after the Jordan River, providing almost half the West Bank's water supply. In the first phase in the north, the wall has already confiscated 36 Palestinian groundwater wells, and some 14 other wells are threatened with demolition since they lie in the wall's buffer zone. Hence, Gush Shalom reports that the land lost in the northwest is not just its size only. It contains nearly 80% of the West Bank really fertile land.
So, good. We have just a little bit of time left. He's talking about the wall. So could you tell us about the wall and the significance of the wall to the situation going on?
Well, Israel is calling the wall a separation wall or a barrier. The Palestinians call it or the Israelis call it a fence. The Palestinians call it the apartheid wall. And it is an attempt by Israel to do, as I see it, what it did 15 years ago in Gaza. It created a monstrous concentration camp in Gaza. People simply can't leave anymore. There are people who have spent their entire life in the most densely populated spot on earth. Israel seems determined to do the same thing to the West Bank.
Okay, great. So we're running out of time, but thanks to our viewers for watching, and thank you for coming over. And it has been my pleasure. Thank you.
Our pleasure.
See this.